Gosh. Okay, everybody. Hi, this is Professor Applewhite, and I want to just thank you all for joining today and watching this lecture on deviance and social control. I am going to share my slides with you shortly. Just give me 1 minute, and then we can get into it. So the funny thing is I actually recorded this lecture already, and somehow it didn't record. The internet went out on the source that I was using, and so um, I could not. My recording didn't take, so I'm recording it again. We're going to try to go through it slowly as best we can, and we'll take it from there. Okay, so I'm first going to share my screen. Then I'll put it in slide mode. Here we go. Okay, so this chapter is on deviance and social control. After reading this chapter or watching this lecture, you should be able to do or answer the following questions, right? So what is deviance, right? And how do social groups distinguish themselves from one another? We'll also discuss the difference between statistical deviance and social deviance. We're also going to define the term social norms. The second big question that you should be able to answer at the end of this chapter is, how is social control imposed on society? Give me 1 minute. I want to turn on transcription. So, and I want to turn on closed captions. So give me 1 minute. That way, even if the volume isn't being heard, you can see everything that I am sharing. Okay? So, let's get back to it. So in this chapter, we're also going to discuss how is the social control imposed on society. Right, we'll do that by talking about how acceptable behaviors learned through socialization, and which societies exert control, social control through positive and negative sanctions. We'll talk about social stigma and how it can serve as a sanction or punishment for deviant behavior. And then we'll analyze the differences between social and criminal deviance. Finally, we'll talk about how is moral behavior defined and regulated. Okay, we'll distinguish between interested and disinterested groups, and we'll look at the history of alcohol use and how it has moved from being the norm to deviant to, again, being a norm. We'll also talk about drug use, including the use of the history of opium use, how that relates to heroin use, and prescription pill use and abuse today, okay? And then we'll talk about power and inequality and how it impacts deviance. So take a look at this picture. What do you see? Well, this is a picture of the event that took place on January 6, 2021, at the Capitol building, okay? Well, why is it an example of deviance? Because to have people invade the Capitol is against the law. To have people challenge the results of an election is against the law. To try to overthrow the results of an election is against the law. And so we define deviance as simply a violation of the norms or breaking the norms. Okay, and so in this case, when you disagree with the political process, right, there is a means to challenge it, but this is not the means. This is a violation of the rules, right? The Constitution sort of verifies and tells us what the rules are around um, general elections. And so this was a violation of the Constitution and our laws. And laws are norms, right? The strange thing about this picture, which some of you may or may not know, is that many of the people who were involved in the uprising on January 6th, some of them were public servants. They were law officers, enforcers. They were political leaders, elected officials. And so so to sort of neglect um, your role as a law enforcement officer or as a political or elected official who by law has to comply with the choices of citizens, then that is also a sign of deviance. So to understand what deviance is, we got to talk about what is normal, right? Remember what I said, deviance is just really a violation of the norms or a violation of the norms of society. So we have to consider who decides what is normal and what is deviant. And the way you do that is really you have to ask the question, who holds power? Who holds the power to decide what is the norm? And who has the power to say that something is a violation of the norm or the rules? Right. And so maybe understanding the nature of groups helps us to understand normality and deviance, right? Normality is just like norms, right? How norms play out. So let's define what a social group is. A social group is a collection of people who interact with one another and who have a shared sense of belonging, right? An example could be families, right? We all belong to social groups, whether it be if you play on a baseball team or you are in you're on the school the school choir, or you are in a magic trading card group. Those are all types of groups. So what do groups have in common? That they interact with each other and they have some shared sense of belonging, right? The thing about groups is that we experience them throughout our lives, and groups can have both a positive and a negative affirmation, okay? A positive affirmation is a signal like of who is in the group and who's not. And a negative affirmation are those who aren't allowed to do um, what members of the group aren't allowed to do, right? If they're to retain membership in that group, okay? And so I want to share the example with you of something I watched on television last week or 2 weeks ago. I was watching National Geographic, and on it there was this show about this man who was a neo-Nazi essentially, and he had reformed and he had like given up or renounced um, being a Nazi, and so the show was about his sort of his journey from being a neo-Nazi to reforming and denouncing Nazism and how we got there. And so um, I was in a hotel and I was watching television and I saw it, and I I remembered the guy's face. And I remembered his face because back in the 90s or maybe the 80s, I saw this man on a talk show called the Montel Williams Show. And on the show, he was talking about how he was, part of the Aryan Nation, and, he was a neo-Nazi, and how he believed that whites, well, whites, that was the superior race, and that all other groups were inferior. And he talked about the ways and how, you know, um, interracial relationships and was inbreeding, and that these people were defective, and that he would do anything in his power to like get rid of these people. And so I remember that, so when I saw his face, I was like, oh my God, this is the guy that I saw on that talk show. So fast forward 35 years later, this guy is now in Auschwitz, right? And Auschwitz is a concentration camp that Nazi Germany like established to take people that they were executing, right, or committing genocide towards. They took them to Auschwitz, right? where they prepped them to execute them, right? And they did that to Jews, they did it to people who were different, essentially. Um, and so he talked about like, so he was there sort of as like to reconcile all the bad things he had done in his life and in his earlier life, and how he had gotten to the point from being a Nazi to like denouncing Nazism and like starting a new way of life. And so what he said, the whole time when, he's telling us, oh, I'm not a Nazi anymore, and I found that difficult to believe that you could like live, with these feelings of hate for so long and then suddenly um like stop hating people, And I wanted to know what was it that caused this change in him? What caused this sort of like what motivated him to give up his beliefs around Nazism and supremacy and you know um anti-Semitism and all of those things. And so what he talked about was he talked about how he was drawn into the neo-Nazi party. And he talked about being drawn into the neo-Nazi party as a result of growing up in his household. Now, his household was pretty interesting, right? His household was made up of his father, who was a psychiatrist, right? He came from a middle-class family from Canada, right? In Canada, they have their racial unrest and their own issues as well. But when I first heard his story, first heard this, I thought it was really shocking that his origins of becoming a Nazi started in Canada, and I also thought it was unusual that his father was a psychiatrist and he turned out to be a Nazi. But what he went on to say was that his father was very abusive. His father was an abusive person who often physically and verbally and emotionally abused him. And for him, he felt as if he was like a misfit, a reject, right? And so that is how he sort of came across um, neo-Nazism. He felt found these people who were like him, that were misfits like him. He was very much into the punk scene. He was very much into like this sort of you know, just like being like a subculture that like sort of rejected the norms, rejected conventional like lifestyle or whatever. And so he started embracing neo-Nazism. And so when I heard his story, it made me understand how he could have slid into being a neo-Nazi. I don't think of course it's a horrible thing and it's good that he kind of made some resolution with it, but he talked about how he was positively affirmed, right, by the people who were members of this group of neo-Nazis. And because of like the challenges he had with his dad, that is what pushed them towards neo-Nazism or the neo-Nazi party. So as you can see here, positive affirmations by the people within that group, right, can pull you into a group that may go against your values or maybe do bad things, right? You may also be attracted, right, to groups because of negative affirmations, right? Feeling like you're rejected, feeling like you're a misfit, right? And so for him, he sort of glammed onto this group because he felt like he fit in, right? Even though some of the things that the group was doing, like burning crosses on people's lawns, sort of uh committing graffiti and attacks on people's homes and on people. Um, he felt like he belonged because he was with these group of people that he felt you know, that was like him. So that's positive affirmations and negative affirmations within a group. One of the things that's important to understand when we talk about deviance is also this idea of symbolic boundaries. Okay. And symbolic boundaries are simply ideas and values about who the group members are. So it gives the members and a group its identity, but it also establishes physical boundaries among the group. Okay, so I'll give you an example. So, in the example that I'm sharing with you about this neo-Nazi, right? If you are a part of the Nazi party, like this young man, what it means, what are the symbolic boundaries? Well, it's like you believe that, that the white race is superior, right? So anybody within that group, right, or it could be considered a part of the group within that boundary, or it can be considered a part of that group. And if you represent people who are not a part of the white race, then you are outside of the boundaries. Like you are not in the group, right? And that it can also represent something symbolically, right? Like if you're white, then he believed the people who within his group were superior, and anybody else who was outside of like who wasn't white, who wasn't heterosexual, who wasn't a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, or who, if you were Jewish or some other religion other than Christianity, then you were outside of the boundaries of his group, right? That's symbolic boundaries, right? And so group boundaries also is a key aspect of understanding deviance, right? Because it tells you like who fits the norms and who is outside of the norms um, within the group, right? So it's a key aspect of understanding deviance. It plays a role in defining acceptable behavior, because if you know what the boundaries of the group are, then you know anything outside of those boundaries is a violation of those norms. Okay, right? Within that group, you have norms, and anything outside of that group, outside of the boundaries, is a violation of the norms or considered deviant. So who would be deviant? Well, let LGBTQIA might be considered deviant because they're not what heterosexual. Who else is considered deviant? Anyone who is non-white, right? Anyone who is a Christian, those are considered outside of the boundaries of the group, right? They are considered deviant. And in this case, his group, right, establishes the norms. So group identity provides status, right? We talked about status in chapter 2. We talked about it again in chapter 4 and chapter 5. Status, right, is as a social position that we hold that's based on characteristics within society that give us either advantage or disadvantage or both, right? And so in the case of using the same example, working example of the neo-Nazi, right? The status that he held was as a white heterosexual Christian male, right? That was his status. He believed that like that is what classified membership within that group, but also anybody who didn't hold that status, right, is outside of that group, outside of the boundaries, and therefore are considered deviant. So if you're gay, you're deviant. If you're Hindu, or if you are Jewish, then you are deviant, right? If you are not white, you are deviant, right? So the status, the group identity provides us a status, right? And so the group sets rules for what members must and must not do, and the rules can be written down and explicit, but also the written rules for the group membership often include punishments, right? So what do you do if you violate the rules of this neo-Nazi group, right? Well, you get punished, right? The people who violate those norms, anybody outside of the boundaries of the group, right? They can be punished for violation, right? For just simply being, gay, or simply being Jewish, right? And so punishments need to appear rational to be acceptable as legitimate within that group. Okay. All right, let's move on. So, um, so now we'll talk about statistical deviance versus social deviance. Okay. So, what is the distinction between statistical versus social deviance, right? Well, the difference really is the distinction is between what like something that is happens frequently versus something that happens like rarely or not very often, okay? And whether those behaviors violate the rules or the norms, okay? Well, what are rare behaviors? It can be deviant in the sense that they're uncommon, but not necessarily deviant in a sociological sense. So I'll give you an example, right? Like many of us might consider like marrying your cousin, right, as deviant, right? Like because it's not common. Most people don't marry their cousins. Why? Because you're blood related, right? And they're also like sort of these like it's a taboo in some ways, right? But there have been times within history and in different places in the world where people do marry their cousins, right? And so that's considered like a rare behavior, right? Um, so we also can consider it statistically deviant, right? It's rare or uncommon, right? Another thing that might be rare or uncommon is to marry your sibling, right? That that happens, but it may happen very rarely or like uncommon. It's statistically deviant, right? As opposed to something that's socially deviant, right? Well, what might be an example of something that's socially deviant, right? Well, it's a behavior that violates the societal rules. So uh if you had sex with your cousin, right? Like that might be considered socially deviant, right? If you or if you fooled around with your cousin, right? I'm using the same example, right? But something that's statistically deviant means that it happens very rarely. It's very uncommon, right? I'll give you another example. Matricide isn't something that is statistically deviant, right? Like most people don't kill their mothers. The people like if someone kills their mother, it's a very rare occasion, right? Um, in comparison to like murder overall, right? Which is probably socially deviant and it probably happens it's more common than like someone killing their mother. Okay, so statistical deviance or statistically deviant versus socially deviant. Take a look at this image here. Okay, in this image you see a woman, she's dressed in a hijab, right? And this is based on a law that was passed in 1989 in France, right? Where um, Muslim women were forbidden, or a law was passed that they could not wear the hijab in public schools, right? Now, it's like maybe some people felt very strongly about, in France about people not wearing hijabs. But when you think about it, right, how many people in France actually wear hijabs? How many people in France are actually Muslim, right? So this is an example of statistical deviance, right? Like it's uncommon or rare for people to wear hijabs at all because, well, why to be Muslim is a minority religion within France, right? But they felt so strongly about it, right, that they passed a law, right? They felt that it was like a, social deviance. So that's a good example that shows you the difference between statistical versus social deviance. So, so what's considered deviant or criminal has little to do with how common it is, right? For example, right? Do you think that having an extramarital affair or having a sexual relationship with somebody other than um your your um your husband or wife is deviant? Well, most people would consider that deviant, right? Or smoking marijuana. Some people might throw smoking marijuana is deviant, right? But it's not uncommon, right? Many people like cheat on their spouses, or more than you probably imagine, and many people smoke marijuana even though it's illegal, right? So that's an example of something that could be deviant or criminal, right? And there's a difference, right? You can't really get, well, technically, although some states that you probably can, right? But in most places, in most states, you cannot be uh like criminalized for committing adultery. And in some places in the United States, while most places some places you are not, it's legal to smoke marijuana, some places it's not, right? So what's deviant versus what's criminal? Okay. No, so normalizing is to recast a behavior in a frame that rescues a person as normal, even as the behavior is deemed deviant. Okay. It's when you recast the behavior into a frame that rescues a person as normal, even as the behavior is deemed deviant, right? So where do we see when we normalize behavior? Well, you see the normalizing process as it relates to mental health, right? Um, right? Like a lot of behaviors or a lot of actions that we see today, we now understand may be a result of mental health issues, whereas in the past we might have thought of it as deviant behavior. Okay. So for example, if you stutter, right? Like we know that stuttering is probably a result of a physiological and a sort of a mental sort of like, issue, but like back in the past, it might have been considered just deviant, right? Or having a learning disability, being dyslexic, right? We've normalized it because we understand more about it, or we've made it. It's people have always had or had learning disabilities, but now we've learned more about it so that we can normalize it because what we realize is not it's not uncommon for somebody to have a learning disability. When large numbers of people start disregarding the same rule, the typical responses to normalize the deviant behavior. I'll give you an example with phone use, okay? When cell phones were like broadly introduced to American, the American public, right? It was considered deviant to like take a phone call at the dinner table, right? But as time went on and cell phones became more prevalent, right? Or more and more people use their phone maybe at the dinner table, right? So something that was once considered deviant has been normalized. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about normalizing. So let's define what a social norm is. What is a social norm? A social norms are unstated, unwritten, and non-articulated rules. The enforcement is a vital aspect of social control, and a huge number of unwritten rules exist in everyday society. So it must be mastered to avoid appearing deviant. Norms, as we talked about in chapter 5, are the basic rules of society. They help us to know what is and is not appropriate to do, and they tell us about the nature and character of society. The origin of some norms are obscure, and they often are related to some values of society. So let's talk about how society imposes social control on its members. Society imposes rules about norms and deviant behavior, right? It establishes laws and criminal codes, right? And remember, laws are really norms that are enforceable. Like they are so they are so important to a society that they feel like they have to codify it or make codes around it, right? So that's where laws come in. So, and then there are also institutions of social control, like the police, criminal courts, prisons, and jails, right? And even mental health facilities in some cases, right? So why mental health facilities? Because like if you murder somebody and like somebody believes that you murdered them because you have mental illness, right? Then that institution of social control becomes um, the mental health institution, okay? So what is social control? It's societal regulations of behavior to encourage conformity to and discourage deviance from the norms, right? It's really what it's trying to do is to regulate your behavior, to control how you behave on a societal level. Now, I want you to think about the various ways that you experience social control. Well, you probably experience social control in every social institution that you're a part of. In the family, what you can eat and what you can't eat, what time you should go to bed, what time you should wake up, what time you should come home, what kind of grades you can get, right? What you can wear. Those are all forms of social control that start in the very first social institution that you are a part of, the family, right? But as we move out into the world, right, when we go into school, there are other forms of social control that you learn and you're socialized into, right? Well, you're socialized into like raising your hand, getting to class on time, following directions, how to take exams, um, like all sorts of rules that we have or norms that really act as a form of social control. Okay. And what that does is it regulates your behavior to encourage conformity and discourage deviance from the norm. Think about somebody who walks in a classroom late. Well, how do we treat them? How do fellow students treat somebody who walks in late? They kind of give them a look like they've done something wrong. How might the teacher or the professor treat them? They'll give them a look, maybe they'll say something, maybe they won't, right? But what that behavior and that interaction, what it demonstrates is that you have in some ways violated the norms of the social institution of education. So like we talked about in chapter 5, society has a way of constricting or like constricting our behavior, constraining our behavior, forcing us to act, right? Of controlling us in some ways, of making us conform. And a lot of this happens through the socialization process. We talked about this in chapter 5. So socialization is learning the basic rules of society and the rules of society. It starts in empathy, and it continues throughout our lives, right? Throughout the life course, from birth to death. When we become a member of a new group, we must learn the ways of the group and what is and not acceptable for group members. Socialization may occur through imitation, and the socialization process is easier when there is a mentor to teach a new member the rules. Let's think about like work or the job or the workplace as a social institution. When you start a new job, typically, well, what happens? You have somebody training you on how to do the job, right? You have somebody who is actually socializing you on the do's and don'ts of the job. They're giving you the rules, they're giving you the norms of the job, what you can and cannot do. In some ways, that's very formal. It's based on policies. And if you violate those policies, you could be in jeopardy of like losing that job, right? So we go through a socialization process in many ways in terms of learning the norms or when we become a part of a group. When we go to school, when we start work, when we start a family, um, when you have a roommate, when you live on your own, there are all these norms that we are taught, we're socialized around. They start in your family, they happen in education, they happen in school, they happen in the healthcare system, right? Like think about like the norms that we had to learn as a result of the pandemic, right? We had to learn norms that people probably hadn't been exposed to before, right? Social distancing, wearing a mask, right? Testing, getting vaccinated, right? For some people, they never experienced some of the things that we experienced, myself included, right? During this sort of pandemic we learned new norms. We were socialized into like how to sort of act within the context of the healthcare system. So socialization into normal behavior is necessary throughout life, right? New social context requires to learn appropriate behaviors. And most of the time we don't realize we're undergoing socialization. Take a look at this image. It's an image of a sorority, right? They're all taking a picture together, right? When I was in college, I was in a fraternity, right? A new sorority or fraternity members, you'll learn norms and rules about the organization through a process of socialization. And afterwards, you're expected to follow the customs or of the group, right? Like in some cases, it might be like which fraternities and sororities you can hang out with, who you can date, what you can wear to certain events, right? What events you have to attend, like participating in community service, right? Um, there are a lot of like customs that come along with being a part of the group of like a fraternity or sorority. Think about the other groups that you belong to or you are part of, whether it be the baseball team or the debate team, whether it be your church choir. There, you are socialized into being a part of that group. There are norms and rules that you're expected to follow. So now we're going to talk about sanctions and rewards, right? And how sanctions and rewards contribute to conformity and resistance. Well, what are sanctions? Sanctions are simply punishments that groups and societies establish to enforce norms. That it's one of the key dimensions of social control, and it enforces lessons of socialization and are applied to socially deviant behavior. Okay, sanctions. For me, if I brought bad grades home, I lost privileges, right? I wasn't allowed to watch television. 1 year in high school, I failed technical drawing. I was supposed to go on a family vacation to go to Disney World, but because I failed this course, technical drawing, my mom forced me to go to summer school, and I didn't go on a family vacation. That's a sanction. But another way that we encourage conformity and resistance is through rewards, right? And seeking rewards is also a method of social control. It provides us with rewards, including praise, awards, and salary raises, right? You know, as a professor, if I do a good job, I get evaluated, I can get a promotion. I get promotion based on like publications that I write, at conferences that I present at, right? Books that I write, all those things like help me to advance in my career. I'm rewarded for doing what is expected of me, to conforming to the behavior of being a professor. When I was a young kid, like if I remember when I was in the first grade, my mom was like, if you learn all your multiple multiplication tables up into 12, then I will buy you an Evil Knievel. And I learned all my times tables up to 12, and my mom got me an Evil Knievel for my birthday when I was 5 years old, right? So these are ways of um of teaching members of society to conform or resist. Well, what are formal sanctions? Formal sanctions are used to enforce norms that are written down. They may be enforced by a group of people who have been given the power to do so. So, like you're at work and somebody touches you in an inappropriate way, right? There are formal sanctions if that person has violated the policies of the workplace, right? They can be punished. They could be reprimanded, given a warning, and in some cases they can be fired, right? There can be litigation like filed against them, right? There are also formal rewards. They include good grades, awards, or promotions, right? For some people, for some teachers in K through 12, if they like get, all of their students to pass the statewide exams, they might get a bonus in their pay, right? So you can be rewarded for right for conforming, for following the rules, following the norms. There are also informal sanctions, and it's expressing disapproval without invoking written rules, maybe not being invited to an event or a party, maybe being overlooked for some kind of something that's happening in the workplace or at home. Right? You didn't wash the dishes, you won't be able to have ice cream tonight, or you know, your mom doesn't talk to you because you didn't wash the dishes, or right. And informal rewards, and these includes compliments. So the process of conforming to norms is not always as simple as following rules. Sometimes deviance can invoke a positive response. Let's think about social movements and civil disobedience, right? Oftentimes people commit deviant acts because the norms that have been created do not mesh with their lives, right? Think about the civil rights movement, or think about the LGBTQIA movement, the Stonewall uprising, or um, right? Well, why did the people involved in Stonewall push back, right? Well, they felt like they were being their rights were being violated because they were gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender. And they pushed back, right? So they broke the rules because they felt like their rights were being violated. The same thing for the civil rights movement, right? People, Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King, but people resisted because they felt like their rights were being ignored, right? They felt like they weren't getting equal rights under the law. And so even though there were laws that like allowed this to happen, they resisted the laws. They took deviant acts against the law because they felt like the law was right. And what happened? In most cases, those laws were overturned. So what does that say to you? It says that sometimes we may have norms, right, that may not be reflective of the needs of everyone involved. And so what begs the question is like, who decides what the norms are? And who decides what is deviant and what is normal? Right. And so sometimes conforming can evoke a negative response, right? So if you sometimes doing the right thing, right, somebody might see you as a kiss ass or a teacher's pet. As societies have become more complex, there have been a shift towards more formal social control. So let's talk about social stigma, right? So social stigma is labeling of an individual as defective in some ways, and tendencies for others to read the individual accordingly, right? So you could be stigmatized based on your behavior, right? You could be labeled as deviant for something that you've done. Sometimes you can be labeled as deviant, or stigmatized as deviant, um, outside of anything that's in your control. So, for example, if you were a woman in the 1915 or whatever, maybe you were considered like you couldn't do certain jobs. You weren't allowed to vote. You weren't allowed to manage your money. Well, why? Because you were considered to be inferior, or that you couldn't handle those kind of things, right? That is a stigma. right? You are considered defective by simply being a woman. Same thing you can think about for like people of color and the civil rights movement, um, gays, lesbians, bisexuals, transgender, right? They could be stigmatized by a label that was assigned to them that they have no control over, right? Irving Goffman, remember Irving Goffman from chapter 4 and chapter 5? Irving Goffman talks about impression management, dimming the light, right? He also talks about stigma. And he argues that stigma creates a spoiled identity. He said all stigmas impose a negative identity or credential on someone that others will recognize. So for example, in our country, you can be, and you're arrested and convicted of it. You can be labeled as a sex offender. Well, what happens if you're labeled as a sex offender? Well, if you're labeled as a sex offender, right, you are put in a registry, you are tracked, you have to let the government know exactly where you are living, what kind of work you're doing, and who you're working with for the rest of your life. They also keep a record of all the sexual offenders that live within like different communities. That is stigma, right? The thing about, like being labeled is like once you take on that label, once you have this spoiled identity, you can't really remove it oftentimes, right? Even only people can remove it sometimes are the people who have the authority to move it, okay? Let me show you a quick example. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. I'm going to show you something that you can find if you like kind of go online and look for it. Give me 1 minute. I'm pulling it up. Okay, I had to pull up this data really quickly. I want to show this to you. Let me share my screen again. This is data that you can find on on the internet, right? And okay, you guys know I'm in Costa Rica, like doing some work over the spring break, and so that's why you see Spanish, okay? But what I typed in, please show me the registered sex offenders for the zip code 10039. That's the zip code that I live in, right? So if you look at this map, they've created a map. They have listed, okay, the name of the sexual offender, the sexual offender's address, which is right down the street from me, their risk level. I don't know what the risk level is, but we can look at it. They have their hair color, their eye color, their date of birth, ooh, 1964. They have their height, their weight. Then they have their race. Okay. And so this, whether the person committed the crime, well, this person committed the crime, and we don't know the nature of the crime that the person committed as well, right? This person has been labeled as a sex offender. This person has been stigmatized. This person has a identity as a result of being a sex offender. Now, so the question becomes, who gets to decide? And I'm not defending this person. I know nothing about this person's situation. But what I'm sharing with you is the idea or the notion is that, you know, who in society can decide who is deviant and who is normal, right? That becomes a real question. And oftentimes, what we've seen in history is that the people who decide are often the people who have power, the most power in society. Okay. And I'll demonstrate this for you shortly. Okay. Let me just go back to the slides. Okay. So we're back to the slides. So right. So let's talk about visible social stigma, right? I just showed you an example of visual social stigma, right? You being registered as a offender, it means that you have a criminal record. It's a formal written report of an individual's legal actions. It may influence other parts of their life. As you can see, being labeled as a sex offender You are not allowed to live in certain proximity of children or schools, right? It can limit your access to employment. So certain places you may not be able to live because if they have children, or you may not be employed in them if they work around children or whatever. And this information, as you can see, may be accessible on the internet. What I just did very quickly is typed in my zip code and typed in sex offenders in my area, and it showed me all the sex offenders who live within my area, right? So that person has a visible social stigma, right? The internet has made this easier, right, for somebody to be stigmatized in some ways, right? It's also made it harder for you to remove a stigma. So let's say you were accused of a crime when you were like 17 years old, okay? You were accused of a crime, you were arrested, but it was found out that you didn't commit the crime and you were found innocent, right? Well, that information that accused you of the crime can still be found on the internet. So that is still also stigmatizing you, even if you didn't commit the crime. So once it becomes on the internet, once it's digitized, it can stay with you forever. That spoiled identity. You know, there's some people, and including a friend of mine, her daughter, who she allowed her boyfriend to take pictures of her in the nude. She didn't think there would be any consequences. The boyfriend sent the pictures out to all the people in his school or other guys in his school. It went around the entire school. She was stigmatized as, you know, a loose girl, promiscuous, whatever, because she shared something personal with somebody that she was dating, right? So visible social stigma. And so what is so like let's go on to what deviance, criminal deviance. The socially deviant behavior is so problematic that they are not left in private hands. It's handled by the criminal justice system and it includes criminal law. So what is viewed as criminal? It's a complicated question. And John Hagen's punishment pyramid, and for those of you who are criminal justice majors, you might be familiar with this already. If you're not, I want you to take a look at the visual that I'm going to show you shortly. It's useful in understanding the difference between social and criminal deviance. Take a look at it. What do you see? Well, at the top of the pyramid, you see things that are considered highly, very harmful. There's a deep consensus that it's criminal, or it is or that it is a violation of or it's socially deviant, right? Think about maybe murder, right? Think about rape, right? And then as you go down the pyramid, right, the wider gets, it means that it's more like not looked at as harmful and looked at as more acceptable. So the last part of this chapter is we're going to talk about moral behavior, how it's defined and regulated. Okay. So what is moral behavior? It's which behaviors will be considered good and right, moral versus bad and wrong. So you have to ask the question, who determines what's good and what's bad? What's right and what's wrong? Well, who? God? Your parents? Right? Maybe someone's parent tells them that
Using, you know,
using,
heroin is good. So
so
who
who
gets to
gets to
decide
decide
like what the
what the
morals
morals
are,
are,
right?
right?
What is
What is
considered a
considered a
moral
moral
behavior is
behavior is
constantly at
constantly at
issue.
issue.
In any
In any
society,
society,
different groups
different
will
groups
have
will have
different
different
views and
views and
understanding,
understanding,
right? But
right? But
when it's
when it's
killing or
killing or
murder,
murder,
okay.
okay.
Well,
Well,
we
we
typically think
typically think
about
about
murder
murder
as like
as
something
something
wrong and
wrong and
killing is
killing is
wrong.
wrong.
But what
But
if
what if
it's like
it's like
you
you
are
are
killing
killing
somebody to
somebody to
protect your
protect your
mother
mother
or your
or your
son,
son,
right?
right?
Is
Is
killing
killing
acceptable in
acceptable
those
in those
cases?
cases?
So who
Who
decides
decides
who
who
makes the
makes the
decisions
decisions
around
around
moral
moral
behavior?
behavior?
And
And
oftentimes this
oftentimes
is
this is
often
often
connected to
connected to
power.
power.
Okay.
Okay.
In any
In any
society,
society,
different
different
groups will
groups
have
will have
different
different
views and
views and
understanding.
understanding.
How does
How
the
does the
definition
definition
change over
change over
time?
time?
Think
Think
about
about
like
like
even when you
even when
think
you think
about
about underage
people who have
people who have
sex with
sex with
underage
underage
like
like
girls or
girls or
boys,
boys.
there's a
There's a
period
period
in
in
our
our
history
history
where that
where
was
that was
more
more
acceptable.
acceptable.
It
It
was
was
found more
found more
acceptable
acceptable
because
because
there was
there
a
was a
lack of
lack of
understanding
understanding
about the
about the
development of
development of
children or
children or
whatever,
whatever,
right?
right?
So that's
So that's
changed over
changed over
time,
time,
where it's
where it's
seen as
seen as
deviant,
deviant,
right?
right?
But some
But
of you
some of you
you
may
have
have
grandparents who
grandparents
got
who got
married at
married at
14,
14,
15,
15,
right? To
right? To
somebody who
somebody
was
who was
older.
older.
And
And
how
how
does
does
society
society
attempt to
attempt to
control
control
moral
moral
behavior?
behavior?
So interested
interested
versus
versus
disinterested.
disinterested.
There are two
There are
kinds
two
of
kinds of
reasons for
reasons for
creating
creating
rules or
rules or
for
for
moral
moral
behavior and
behavior and
systems of
systems of
punishment
punishment for all
for their
for their
violation.
violation.
Those that
Those that
arise
arise
out of a
out of a
desire to
desire to
protect
protect
wealth and
wealth and
private
private
property,
property,
and those
and
that
those that
attempt to
attempt to
direct and
direct and
control the
control the
behavior of
behavior of
individuals.
individuals.
What
What
comes to
comes to
mind
mind
when I
when I
see
see
this is
this is
like
like
the the
the
protests that
protests
took
that took
place
place
during
during
2020
2020
after
after
the
the
murder
murder
of
of
George
George
Floyd,
Floyd,
right?
right?
You saw
You
a
saw
lot
a
of
lot of
people
people
protesting.
protesting.
You saw a
You
lot
saw a
of
lot of
police
police
out
out
showing their
showing their
presence. Well,
presence.
what
Well,
were
what
they
were they
doing?
doing?
And
Often
in
in
many
many
occasions, they
occasions,
were
they were
protecting
protecting
property
property
rather than
rather than
protecting
protecting
people.
people.
I think
I
that's
think
what
that's
the
what the
authors are
authors are
talking
talking
about
about
here,
here.
right? And
Right.
what
And what
where
when
in
in
terms of
terms of
privileged
privileged
groups,
groups,
they show
they
a
show a
strong
strong
interest in
interest in
protecting
protecting
property.
property.
They
They
create the
create the
laws
laws
against
against
theft and
theft and
fraud, and
fraud. And
eventually these
eventually these
laws
laws
filter
filter
down to
down to
protect
protect
everyone's
everyone's
property.
property.
Think
Think
about
about
like
like
places
places
like
like
Walgreens. You
Walgreens.
know, have you ever
Have you
seen
ever seen
security
security
guards in
guards in
Walgreens or
Walgreens or
police
police
officers in
officers in
Walgreens
Walgreens
with
with
guns?
guns?
They're not
They're not
there to
there to
protect
protect
customers.
customers.
They're
They're
there to
there to
protect
protect
property.
property.
Do you
Do you
understand
understand
this?
this?
That those
That those
security
security
guards who
guards
have
who have
guns, who
guns
will
who will
probably
probably
work for the
work for the
police
police
department
department
or moonlight
moonlight
by
by
working as
working
a
as
security
security
guard.
guard.
They are
They are
there to
there to
protect
protect
property and
property
not
and not
people.
people.
Ponder on
Ponder
that
on
one.
that.
Other
Other
laws that
laws that
relate to
relate to
behaviors are
behaviors are
designed to
designed to
control
control
morals and
morals and
social
social
behavior.
behavior.
To
To
prevail,
prevail,
laws must
laws must
find
find
broad
broad
popular
popular
support.
support.
Think about
Think
the
about the
laws
laws
around like
around like
bathrooms and
bathrooms and
trans
trans
people,
people,
right?
right?
Is that
Is that
really
really
about
about
like,
like,
is it
is it
about
about
safety or is it
safety or is
about
it about morale,
morals and
morals and
social
social behavior?
behavior? I
I
believe it's
believe it's
around
around
morals and
morals and
social
social
behavior.
behavior.
And really
And really
trying to
trying to
control
control
the behaviors of certain groups. Because
because like
most
most
people are not
people are
going to
not going to
encounter a
encounter a
trans
trans
person in the
person in the
bathroom. That's the
bathroom. That's the
bottom
bottom
line.
line.
New York
New York
City is a
City is a
bubble,
bubble,
right?
right?
Like New
Like
York
New
is
York
not
is
like
not
other
like other
places, but
places, but
most
most
people
people
don't live
don't
in
live in
places where
places
they've
where they've
ever
ever
met a
met a
trans
trans
person
person
before.
before.
So I
So
do
I do
believe this
believe
is
this is
connected to
connected to
morals and
morals and
social
social
behavior.
behavior.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, there are
Well, there are
two.
two.
So to
So to
prevail,
prevail,
laws
laws
must
must
find
find
broad
broad
popular
popular
support. I
support. I
also
also
think
think
about
about
trans
trans
athletes.
athletes.
When we
When we
looked at the
looked at the
numbers
numbers
around
around
trans
trans
athletes a
athletes a
couple of
couple
weeks
of
ago,
weeks
I
ago, I
think there
think
was
there was
something
something
like
like
what 19
19
trans
trans
athletes
athletes
across the
across the
country at
country at
every
every
echelon.
echelon.
Do you
Do you
remember when we
remember when
looked
we
at
looked
that
at
in
that in
class?
class?
But yet
But yet
people feel
people
the
feel
need
the
to
need to
pass
pass
laws
laws
around
around
transplant
transplant
athletics.
athletics.
Why
Why
pass a
pass a
law?
law?
Why
Why
spend
spend
money and
money in
litigation
litigation and
right
right
and
thousands and
thousands of
thousands of
dollars to
dollars to
pass a
pass
law
a law
that's only
that's
going to
only going to
affect
affect
19
19
people in the
people in the
entire
entire
country?
country?
Because that's
Because that's
around
around
morals and
morals
that's
and that's
around
around
what is
what is
considered
considered
deviant and
deviant
not
and not
deviant.
deviant.
It's
It's
not
not
practical,
practical,
but it
but
has
it is
gained broad popular support, right? So who gets to decide that that's important, that that's an important issue? Why are we spending so much money on something that's really, in my opinion, it's so minute because it's such a small number? So there are two kind of punishments. They're not always independent. It's an effort to control the morality of the poor is often, uh-oh, uh, we're having technical difficulties. Give me 1 minute, please. Sorry, we had a little bit of a technical glitch, but I think we're back right now. Let me try to share my, let me see where we are. If I can share my screen again. Okay, I think we're back. We had a little bit of a technical glitch. I hope it didn't cause us too much issue. Um, let's try to get everything back in order. Let's see. Who can I? I'm gonna try to share. Okay,
okay,
we're back.
We're back.
Mm. Mm. Okay.
Okay. Okay. All right. So the next thing. Okay. Not quite sure what happened, but it seems like we had a little bit of a technical glitch, but was able to fix it. So let's get back to it. Okay, there we go. Okay. So this will be the last part we'll talk about before we sort of call it 7 o'clock. Okay, so other laws relate to behavior. So it's designed to control morals and social behavior. We were talking about trans people and the bathrooms, right? And so um what I started to talk about before we had a little bit of a technical glitch was the idea around how we often try to control the poor through morality, right? But oftentimes our attempts or our efforts to control morality of the poor is often related to the interests of the powerful and maintaining order, right? When I tell you that people, like the police were out there during the George Floyd protest, they weren't out there necessarily to protect people or like to bring order to people. What they were doing was protecting property, right? Um, and so moral reform focused on the poor has often contributed to stigmatizing them, right? Think about these conversations that we have about like what poor people should eat or what they should spend their money on, right? Really what it is oftentimes is it's like the middle class or the upper class imposing their values or their beliefs on poor people, right? Without giving poor people the choice of what they can and cannot do, right? Right. Oftentimes when they're talking about food stamps, right? And you've probably like witnessed this going into a supermarket or something and seeing somebody use food stamps and use them for something that you might think or deem as inappropriate, right? Well, who gets to determine what somebody can spend their food stamp money on, what foods they can and cannot eat? That is moralizing and stigmatizing people because it's simply because they're poor. Because you're poor, you don't deserve to eat lobster, and because you're wealthy, you get to eat as much or whatever you want. Something seems like that seems like it favors the powerful, right? Think about the egg crisis, right? Like, so if you're wealthy, right, and you have access, you can buy as many eggs as you want, and that's okay, leaving other people without eggs because you have the ability to buy as much as you want. Is that fair? Or is that based on the interests of the powerful? I'm not saying what is right or wrong. It's just something I want you to think about as it relates to norms and deviance and how we decide what is on the normal and what is considered deviant. Let's talk about alcohol use, okay, and alcohol in America, right? First of all, we got to start by like talking about like how the United States is a place where people regularly and frequently use and abuse alcohol, right? A lot of like deaths, um, assaults, sexual and otherwise, violence, property damage, all of these things, a lot of these things can be highly contributed to alcohol use. Okay. So alcohol use is it's a crisis in some ways in the United States because people use a lot of alcohol. That's the fact of the matter. Maybe it's not a crisis, maybe that's a strong word, but there's a lot of alcohol use in the United States. Okay. And in the 1830s, the average American drank about 3.5 times as much alcohol as they use today. By the 1920s, there was a dramatic shift in attitudes about alcohol. Well, why? Well, we have to talk about prohibition, which took place during 1920 to 1933. Well, what does prohibition mean? It means like the forbidding or like preventing the act of, right? And so there was a constitutional amendment that made alcohol consumption illegal. And it ended right before the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which also was like the beginning, or like we were in the depression, okay? But it once was illegal to drink alcohol, and that was an amendment that was added to the Constitution. Well, how did that happen? Well, it happened as a result of this group that you see in front of you right now, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Okay, the temperance movement began officially in 1873, and it purposely linked drinking to the rise of new immigrants. We talked about this, right? At the turn of the century, at the end of the 19th century, we saw an influx of immigrants coming from Europe, right? Primarily Polish, um, Irish, Italians, um, coming to the United States for opportunities, right? And because of all of the lack of opportunities and all of the crisis or the social changes that were happening in their home countries. We also needed those immigrants for labor, okay? But when they came, the temperance movement purposely linked drinking to the rise of new immigrants, okay? The older generations, the upper class, middle class, perceived the threat that immigrants as a threat to American values. So they tried to tie alcohol use to immigrants, even though they were using alcohol themselves, right? The Women's Christian Temperance Union, the picture I showed you the previous slide, played an integral role and the stick like and labeling um immigrants as as problems with alcohol, right? They were made up mostly of women married to wealthy and powerful groups. So that their success led to prohibition, but the ban was hard to enforce and ended after massive disobedience. Now think about it. Alcohol was legal at one point, then it became illegal, became against the law, and now it's legal to use alcohol, right? I told you about all the dangers of alcohol, right? Now let's look at drug use and opium, right? Opium has a long history in the United States. It's a derivative of morphine, and it was discovered and developed in the early 19th century. It was used primarily as a painkiller during the Civil War, and it was commonly used as a syrup for household pain during the 19th century. So it was used in households with families, given to children, parents, adults, right? And it contained morphine. Morphine is highly addictive, right? So alcohol versus morphine. Why are we comparing the two? Well, there was, the status, your class status was associated with whether or not alcohol use was good or morphine use was good or bad, right? Morphine was associated with middle class white women. Those are the people who used it. So it wasn't seen as bad or deviant, while alcohol was, right? Alcohol was seen as deviant. Why? Because it was used by working class people, because it was used by newly entered immigrants. So it was demonized. Alcohol users were demonized. And that is what also led to the prohibition of alcohol in the United States. Take a look at this image. This is an image that was actually used to advertise for soothing syrup that had morphine in it, that was given to children. That's highly addictive. Now, morphine is also, the ingredients of morphine are also the ingredients that are used to make heroin, right? Morphine and heroin. In the 20th centuries, doctors were given control over the distribution to limit consumption. They were given the control over the distribution of morphine and heroin. They're like cousins to each other, both highly addictive. Doctors initially prescribed both drugs en masse, right? What does en masse, right? Like in masses. That's what it means. By 1916, en masse prescriptions were outlawed because I guess they started to learn how dangerous morphine and heroin was, right? But even though it was outlawed, it found a place in the black market. And so the production of heroin emerged in the black market. So due to the decline in availability from doctors, you couldn't get it from the prescription from your doctor. And so people went to the black market to get it. They went to people who were selling it illegally, right? So addicts were then portrayed as morally reprehensible. They went from being viewed as a middle class white problem to a working class problem in communities of color. After I finish telling you this, I'm going to share a story with you, right? The end of prohibition coincided with the demonization of opium users. So the drugs didn't change, right? People were still like they were using, morphine syrup. Now they're using heroin, right? They outlaw heroin, so people don't they can't get it through their doctors, but people are still using, right? But the drug didn't change. The patterns of consumption or the patterns of use changed, and the status of who was using it, right? Going from white women using it, white middle class women, to now people of color using it. And so with people of color using it, the status of in their status, right? The drug was demonized and the people who used it were stigmatized. So deviance was related to who was doing the drug, not the drug itself. That's important to understand, that the deviance was related to who was doing the drug, not the drug itself. Okay. Let's talk about the recent opioid epidemic, right? And opioids again are related to morphine and heroin. They're derivatives, right? The opioid epidemic, right, which is like prescription drug use through like Percocet and OxyContin, right? The growing numbers of users who were mostly white users. And it's had what this has led to, because their status is white, it has led to a renewed sympathy for addicts and calls for treatment rather than punishment. This is another shift in societal understanding rather than a change in the drug. The drug didn't change, just who's using it, right? Because these opioid pills, Percocet and Oxycontin, are essentially like heroin in pill form, right? But because it became a problem with whites, because in their status of whites, now treatment was the option rather than criminalizing it, like is what happened with blacks, right? During the heroin epidemic and then also the crack epidemic, right? So I want you to understand that it's not like so. Is it about the action itself being bad? Is it about the drug itself being bad? No. In both cases, with alcohol and these drugs, opium and then opioids, it is who is using the status of the person that uses it that makes it deviant by our society. Okay, you can also think about that with cocaine versus crack use and the Rockefeller laws and how people who don't crack were given often were given higher, longer sentences, right? Even though the amount of crack didn't amount to the same amount as like the sentences that people got for using cocaine or distributing cocaine. That again is status. The last one thing I want to share with you is my experiences as a researcher when I was like new in my career. I interviewed for a job at Yale University. At the time, I was like doing HIV prevention work, and had just got my PhD, and I interviewed for a job at Yale. Here's what the job entailed. The job entailed me studying people, everyday people, right? Who worked in New Haven. They probably lived in some suburb of New Haven, drove into New Haven as lawyers or doctors or even professors, right? They worked their daily shift. When they left to go home, they stopped, buy heroin, go home, shoot up or drug up all during the night, and then go into work the next day. And so the person that I had interviewed with was interested in me being his research assistant and interviewing people who had careers, doctors, lawyers, um, but also use heroin, right? Well, why am I telling you about that? Because of their status as a doctor or lawyer, they are not demonized for heroin use. I mean, they might be demonized if it was found out, but no one thinks to look at them or to study them for heroin use. Although people who are in professional careers use drugs at a very high rate in comparison to other groups. Okay. I feel like I missed a slide. Let's see. Oh, here's the slide. Take a look at this data. Okay, well, let me go over this, right? So, so let's talk about the war on drugs. I talked a little bit about it. Okay. Um, the war on drug was launched in 1985. It increased surveillance and penalties for sale, possession, and use of non-prescription drugs, mostly crack, and cocaine, right? It contributed to mass incarceration, typically of Black and brown people, poor people, with hundreds of thousands of people in jail for drug offenses. Poor and Black people were more likely to be arrested and convicted than white, middle-class, affluent people, yet white people consume more drugs on average than Black people do then and now. So the war on drug has abated for now, but it was widely seen as a failure. Take a look at this data and tell me what you see. If you take a look at this data, for every type of illicit drug, marijuana, cocaine, crack, hallucinogens, inhalants, and methamphetamines, whites far outpace Blacks in their use of the drug in every category. The only category that they don't outpace them is with crack use, and even with crack use, there's equal use between Blacks and whites according to this data. This data is as of 2019. Now, even if you think about the media depiction of who uses crack, right, and who's stigmatized in terms of using crack, right, and the identity of who uses crack, it never looks like a white person. It's always a person of color. So that tells you something there as well. So efforts, let's talk finally about one last thing and then we'll close it out. Efforts to punish gay and lesbian people. For centuries, same-sex relationships largely practiced in the closet. They were arrested or harassed regularly occurred, but was largely invisible. LGBT movement in 1969, patrons of the gay bar, the Stonewall Inn in New York City in the West Village, right? Not far from where we are. They fought back against police harassment, and this led to the gay liberation movement. Well, opponents, they focus on restricting the rights of gays and lesbians through legal means. They use the AIDS epidemic as context to attack them. They blame people who contracted AIDS. They blame them their being infected on the disease because of morals. They said that these people were immoral and that's why they got AIDS, right? Until other people started getting AIDS, right? Until women started getting AIDS, till children started getting AIDS, and then they had to re-examine it. But they linked it to morality. There's shifting laws and attitudes. So in 2003, Lawrence versus Texas overturned the 1985 ruling that had allowed states to keep anti-gay laws. In 2015, the same-sex marriage was legalized by the Obergefell and versus Hodges, where it was legalized, made a law, same-sex marriage. There's more public acceptance of LGBTQIA individuals, but there's also more violence from anti-gay activists. Here's an example, and we'll end here. In June 2016, an anti-gay gunman armed with an assault rifle entered a popular LGBTQIA club in Orlando called Pulse and opened fire, killing 49 people and injuring dozens more in the most vicious act of hate against LGBTQIA communities to date. I'm not sure if that's in the United States or across the world. So more moral campaigns, mask wearing campaign. It encouraged people to wear masks to reduce the spread of COVID-19, both scientific and moral. But the majority thought wearing masks was an ethical responsibility to protect others, but enough people rejected this idea that the campaign was unsuccessful, leading to death. So future crusades, an uncertain future for such crusades and efforts to legislate morality. So we're going to go through a couple more and then we'll call it, okay? So we're talking about power. What is considered deviant or criminal is often arbitrary. Deviance is the result of conscious decisions and actions of specific groups and individuals. Initial ideas of deviance are often shaped by parents. As we get older, power plays a role in what groups define as deviant. We'll define the deviance. In the 1960s, sociologists began research in contexts where deviant behavior was defined by individuals in power in positions of authority. They found an arbitrariness or randomness in who was labeled deviant and how offenses were defined. They found that cops overlooked things that could be considered violations of law, while equally minor acts meet with arrest. Today, sociologists argue that we need to look at how the behavior came to be defined as deviant. So labeling theory is defining deviance happens when powerful groups are able to create and impose their definitions that they want. To understand deviance, we need to focus on how social control actively makes certain behaviors unacceptable. And we'll stop right there, okay? You can finish the rest of the slides on your own. I'll make them available. Thanks for joining me today. Please watch this lecture and you'll have some questions that are connected to it. And I'll see you in class on Tuesday. Thank you.